So I know we're all very familiar with that sound. And sure, it is a little bit taboo. But it's the one thing that we all have in common, and you can't deny it. Most of us don't really like to talk about where our business goes once the business is done. But I've decided that this year, I'd like to delve into how what happens behind closed doors affects all of us out here. So come join me while I learn about New England's most unseen environmental threat, combined sewer overflows.
When we think of New England, it's hard not to think of our old industrial past, our role as forerunners of infrastructural development. But today, the increased urbanization of our towns and cities, the continuous growth of our population, and our rapidly changing climate highlight the infrastructural challenges facing us here in New England. Many Massachusetts cities operate under a combined sewer system. Within a combined sewer system, rainfall runoff, domestic sewage, and industrial wastewater is all collected within one pipe and transported to a local wastewater facility. On a dry day, the system works as it's supposed to. But on wet days, with large or even small storms, the system breaks down. During these days, the stormwater exceeds the capacity of the pipe, and wastewater facilities fill up so quickly that in order to keep water away from houses and streets and avoid devastating floods, they're forced to discharge untreated and/or partially treated wastewater into nearby rivers. This is what we call a combined sewer overflow. We'll focus on three major rivers: the Merrimack River, the Blackstone, and the Connecticut, to learn more about the environmental impacts of CSOs, as well as the ways that CSOs affect the public health of the communities that border these rivers. Throughout the state, we have multiple NGOs, nonprofits, and advocacy organizations that are working to protect us, our rivers, and our watersheds. To help me learn about CSOs, I've worked with 5 incredibly knowledgeable individuals who took the time to share their remarkable insights on an issue that is rarely talked about, yet we all play a major role in. Let's meet the people who have made this possible.
My name is James Plummer. I'm an environmental analyst at NUEPIC, and I run NUEPIC's Stormwater Work Group and National State Revolving Fund Workshop.
So hi, I'm Stephanie Cavino, and I'm the program manager of the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative.
I've been with the Merrimack River Watershed Council about 6 years now, and I got involved because I use the Merrimack River a lot for boating and fishing. I live near it, and I wanted to do what I could to help clean it up.
My name is Katherine Lang. I am the policy director for the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance.
My name is Kelsey Wendling. I work as a river steward in Massachusetts at the Connecticut River Conservancy.
The summer of 2023 was a historically wet summer for Massachusetts.
According to the Boston Globe, this was the second rainiest in recent history, with roughly 20 inches of rain during this time. The impact was felt statewide, not just in Boston. In Western Mass, for example, 3 extreme rain events in July caused serious flooding damage in the towns of Deerfield and Conway.
Due to the intensity of this summer's rainfall, CSOs have become more of a hot topic. Many people working on river conservation and environmental protection reflected on how this summer affected the frequency of CSOs. Here's John McCone as he dives into how this summer affected the Merrimack River region near Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, and Manchester.
Yeah, this has been the worst summer I've seen since I've been here in terms of the number of CSO events. We don't know the volume yet, but I'm sure it's going to be very high. It might be a record breaker for us. But just to give you an example, in June and July, which is a period of time when a lot of people are boating and fishing and wading, swimming in the river, about 40 of those 61 days, the river was under a health alert. People should not have been going into it. Although there were still a lot of people who were, because they just didn't know that it was unhealthy. So that's unusual. In a typical summer, we might see, maybe a quarter of those days when it would be under a health alert. So this is a substantially different year. Yeah, so the community that appears to have produced the most is Lowell. And that's because there's been an infrastructure problem in Lowell for decades, and there's more population, and Lowell is struggling to keep up. Manchester would be the next highest, Manchester, New Hampshire. Part of the issue that's happening here is climate change, and we're seeing a different pattern of weather in this area. So we have these incredibly intense storms that are hitting us very suddenly, and that's just the worst kind of conditions for a CSO. The sewage systems get immediately overwhelmed with the amount of water that's coming in, and there's really no choice but to dump it into the river. And so we've seen just so many days when that happens.
Similarly to the Merrimack River, the Blackstone near Worcester was also heavily impacted by this summer's rainfall.
Yeah, so CSO is definitely an issue. We have done a great job in investing in our wastewater treatment facilities on the Blackstone River. So for instance, we have Upper Blackstone Clean Water, which is a wastewater treatment facility for most of the upper region, so Worcester, Shrewsbury, Millbury, etc., brings their wastewater there. And they've made massive infrastructure improvements so that the water coming out of that facility now, what they tell you on the tour is that actually meets clean drinking water standards. So it's very, very clean. It goes through many different, I think it's like a 4 or 5 step process. But combined sewer overflow is still an issue. So Worcester is an old city, and it just celebrated its tercentennial, its 300th birthday last year, actually. And a lot of our infrastructure is almost just as old. So we're still digging up wooden pipes every now and then. And when we first put in that infrastructure, we had one pipe, and that was it for everything. The second part of your question was how this has changed over time. So we recently did a tour of the combined sewer overflow facility, and what we heard is that typically in a year, Worcester might have 12, maybe 15 different CSO events where the facility will do a settling process, a chlorination and a dechlorination before releasing that water out. That happens maybe a dozen times a year. And this year, in 2023, by July, it had already happened 22 times. So the increase in frequency of these events is absolutely increasing. The headwaters of the Blackstone is over 25% impervious cover. A lot of stormwater goes into this river regardless of CSO. So we typically say that in any area, not just the Blackstone, after a really heavy rainflow, you don't want to be in contact with the water for the first couple of days because of that stormwater. The number one cause of impairment to water quality in Massachusetts is stormwater, and the Blackstone is no different.
Even further west, Kelsey gives her thoughts on the Connecticut River and her prediction on the future impacts.
Yeah, it was an incredibly intense summer in terms of flooding, really historic levels of rainfall. And so we had above average CSO discharges in all our CSO communities. And I think one thing that was challenging about that is people became very aware of the CSO issue, which, as we said, has been going on for decades now. But if you're just learning about it, it sounds really terrible. And it is terrible. We need to fix it, but there was definitely heightened awareness of it. And then it wasn't just CSOs, it was floodwaters, which take anything that's on the streets or on your lawn in agriculture, and it washes that into the river. So then you have the combination of CSOs and runoff, which just led to a summer of people not really being able to go onto the river because it wasn't safe. It's a good question. It could be an indicator. I mean, I think I would take the last 2 summers maybe as an indication. So last summer we had really severe drought. CSOs were not really an issue because it wasn't raining. Of course, that's its own separate problem. And then this year we had all that intense rainfall. So I think with the climate crisis, what we'll see is actually more of both. Summers where CSOs aren't as much of an issue and summers where they are. But hopefully The work that communities are doing to minimize CSOs will mean that even when we have summers like this one with really intense rainfall, we won't see as much CSO discharge.
We know that in the year 2023, there's been over 5.3 billion gallons of untreated sewage from CSO events in our waterways statewide. 5.3 billion gallons is 7 times the volume of Walden Pond. My colleague Max Rome at Charles River figured that out. So if you picture 7 Walden Ponds full of untreated sewage, that's what's happened in just this year alone.
This summer posed a lot of important questions about what's to come for New England towns and cities as we expect to see more volatile weather in the future. The increased frequency of CSOs unveils the disproportionate impact on our historically disadvantaged communities.
Throughout my conversations with John, Kelsey, and Stephanie, I noticed that there was a common theme between the cities that were affected by CSO activity. The cities of Lowell, Worcester, Holyoke, and Springfield all have large minority populations who are also really vulnerable to poverty. All 4 of these cities were represented on the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Population Map created by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. To understand what classifies as environmental justice population, here's the criteria in Massachusetts. 1. The annual median household income is 65% or less of the statewide annual median household income. 2. Minorities make up 40% or more of the population. 3. 25% or more of households identify as speaking English less than very well. And 4. Minorities make up 25% or more of the population, and the annual median household income of the municipality in which the neighborhood is located does not exceed 150% of the statewide annual median household income. As shown, nearly all of Lowell and Worcester, a large portion of Chicopee and Holyoke, and the whole entire city of Springfield classify as environmental justice populations. The vast majority of the approximately 571,799 people who live in these 5 cities are at the highest risk of bearing the environmental consequences of climate change. And during my conversations, Catherine really hit the nail on the head when it comes to understanding these communities and the consequences of CSOs.
So in some of our urban centers, the stormwater pollution problem is coupled with sewage pollution. We have beautiful, charming, old cities, and with those old cities come less charming old sewers. These sewer systems were built in the 1800s, the 1900s, and in some cases haven't been updated since they were built. At the time, the wisdom was to build combined sewer systems. So this is a system that has one pipe that carries the sewage from our homes and businesses into the wastewater treatment plant. That same pipe also carries the rain and snow runoff from the street. So you've got sewage and rain in one pipe being carried to be treated. On a dry day, that's no problem because it's just the sewage. It can get treated at the plant before being discharged as a clean discharge. But when it rains, that pipe is only so big. It is the same size. So by design, these sewers are built to overflow some of that sewage rain mixture into a nearby waterway. That prevents backups into people's homes. It prevents too much from coming into the treatment plant at once, so it saves that process. But it means that we have raw, untreated sewage in our waterways. This is happening in many communities across our state, and it's not just Mass. Certainly many places in the Northeast, from Ohio to Hartford, experience this too. But it happens pretty much every time it rains. If you are putting on a raincoat that day, a combined sewer overflow is probably happening in your system. We also think about this happening with precipitation. We know that our precipitation is changing with climate. We are getting more precipitation. It's coming in heavier, flashier events. Those events totally can overwhelm our combined sewer systems. These were built in the last century. They weren't built for the precipitation that we're experiencing today. They certainly weren't built for the trends that we know will be coming to our cities. So combined sewer overflows are a climate change problem. It's not one that we often think about when we think about climate, but it certainly is correlated to the amount of precipitation that we're receiving. The more heavy rain events that we will experience, the more combined sewer overflows we will also experience. Well, municipalities in Massachusetts have a variety of challenges and opportunities in regards to water quality and water quantity. So their experiences vary, and with climate change, we are having droughts and flooding events happen in places where they historically have not. So you have municipalities who are dealing with large-scale flood events, who are dealing with really intense droughts, who haven't had to before. So that's new knowledge, kind of new territory for them to respond to. And even places that have flooded in the past or experienced droughts, those events are getting more severe and more frequent. So our response at a local level has to scale up with the scale of our climate challenge. I think most people, regardless of where you live, don't know a lot about your wastewater system, which hopefully means that it has never broken down on you and you haven't had to learn about it. Water infrastructure at large, whether we're talking about drinking water or wastewater, is typically out of sight and out of mind. So most people aren't thinking about where their wastewater goes or how it's treated. This is also true in places with combined sewer overflows. Most people haven't heard of that term or don't know what that means. The sewage notification law that passed a few years ago has a signage requirement. Now, if you are going to a public access point and a waterway that has a CSO nearby, sewer operators are required to put up signs telling you what a CSO is, that there is one in this waterway, and what that means for your engagement with the water, that you should avoid the water 48 hours after it's rained. That signage, as well as the notification, the notifications themselves, have increased public awareness about CSOs. The fact that we have combined sewers, people are finding out about this for the first time. This program went into effect last summer, so July of 2022, and there's been a number of headlines since that went into effect where people are finding out, oh my God, there's untreated sewage in my river, that's disgusting. A lot of folks were outraged, obviously, that this was happening. They're finding out that this is not only happening, but is supposed to happen, that it is by design of these systems that we have these discharges, and that is outrageous. It's disgusting in 2023 that we still have this occurring. It feels medieval almost to have this occurring in our urban centers in 2023. So awareness is building thanks to media coverage of these notifications. People are finding out about it, but in general, the awareness still is quite low. The impetus for our involvement in advocating for the sewage notification bill, which is now a law, was public health. We of course want CSOs to not occur at all in our waterways, but that will take a lot of time and money and engineering to make happen. So in the interim, we want to make sure that people know when their local waterways are unsafe for swimming, unsafe for boating, or even touching the water in some extreme cases. So public health of environmental justice communities was a main driver of our advocacy for that bill.
Yeah, so this is a question a lot of people ask. They can't understand why there's sewage going into the river. In this day and age, it just seems preposterous that we're still dumping sewage into rivers. But it is technically illegal. You know, if you or I to do it, we would be fined by the EPA, but communities are allowed to do it. So this is this very complicated issue where communities like Lawrence or Lowell, they have this very old infrastructure and they're not able to fix it very quickly. And so the EPA works with them over a period of decades, really, sets goals for them that they have to achieve in reduction of the amount of effluent that's coming out. And so that's because it's so expensive and it's so disruptive. So I'll give you an example. In Manchester right now, the EPA has just enacted a new consent decree, which is basically a legal document that says, okay, you must meet these parameters within a specific period of time. So the city is spending $250 million to meet all of those regulations. That's a big bill for a city to try to handle. So that gives you an idea of why the EPA allows this to extend out over many years, is that you just can't do it on your own. You can't fix it quickly. So we won't see an end to CSOs perhaps ever, because every time there's a new fix, you know, in the case of Manchester, they're reducing their flow by 50% at the end of 10 years. Well, every time you reduce it by 50%, that price typically goes up for that smaller return. So and the work involved is more complicated. So you get less bang for your buck as you reduce it. So whether or not we're ever going to be able to clean up CSOs, I kind of doubt it.
Yeah.
But we'll kick away, we'll take away at it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this year we've had roughly twice the norm for rainfall. It's unusual. But the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a government agency, it tries to predict long-term what's going to happen with weather and climate. So its prediction is that this kind of summer we've seen this year is going to be much more typical in the future. So we're going to be seeing more and more rain, and we're going to see these tropical downpour type of days. And that's, as I mentioned, that's the worst kind of weather you can have for a CSO. So, based on those predictive models, we're going to see this continue, at least at this level we see now, if not increase. You look at what happened in Leominster a few weeks ago, or last week, I believe. 9 inches of rain in the course of an hour or so, on one very concentrated segment of an area. Those kind of storms are the kind of storms that we can safely say they're going to be happening more and more in the future. And you look at what happened in Leominster, it was devastated by it.
I think it's about 15% of the city of Worcester still has combined sewer overflow, and it's some of our very heavily populated areas and our low-lying areas. So it includes areas like Shrewsbury Street, which is a very popular location for restaurants and businesses, and also a lot of folks live in that area. And then also the one that kind of comes up a lot and people always remember is Green Island. So Green Island is entirely a floodplain. There used to be bogs and marshes there. We filled them in. There used to be a river there. We put it underground, but it's a low-lying area and water wants to go there. So it's a floodplain and it has this combined sewer overflow. Now put on top of that, it's some of the highest ranking environmental justice neighborhoods as well. It's a very transitory population. Most are renters. They're not there necessarily for a very long time and understand, how to get involved and how to make these bigger changes to encourage the city to either change out those pipes or make sure that they're thinking ahead and identifying opportunities for green infrastructure higher in the watershed to take that stormwater out. Because of course, combined sewer overflow, on dry days it's really just stormwater, but on wet days, on dry days it's really just sewer and it's low level flow that it can handle, but on those wet days all that stormwater comes in. So on CSO events they estimate it to be about 90% stormwater and only about 10% sewer. So we really need to be able to address that stormwater issue to address the CSO issue. There are public health concerns because it is such a low-lying neighborhood. There are these times when the facility can't actually handle as much flow that's coming in, and the entire neighborhood will be underwater. So it doesn't happen often, but it certainly happens where they have to close down the roadway and the manhole covers are just popping up. And when that water is at that level, you have raw sewage in your streets. And I don't think that people understand that.
There's still hope for these communities though. From looking at initiatives like the Clean Water Project in Connecticut, we can see glimpses of what the future can look like in Massachusetts. I talked to Kelsey, who gave more details on what the Clean Water Project is, as well as other projects happening in Massachusetts, and affordable green infrastructure projects that municipalities can band together to create to reduce the number of CSO activity.
So the Clean Water Project is an effort to basically clean up the Connecticut River in Connecticut through CSO abatements. And it's been a long project, and there's still a long way to go with it, but the general idea is what they have done already is they've updated some of their wastewater treatment facilities to be more efficient, to be able to process higher volumes of water. They have this extra storage capacity now so that they can treat sewage and stormwater later as opposed to just directly discharging it because the facility's overwhelmed. And they're separating a lot of the pipes in the city, which is a huge project because it means digging up the city streets to update the infrastructure there. Yeah, a lot. So most of the communities have done some sort of mitigation or abatement work. I'd say that Hartford is a good example. They've invested a lot of money into separating the stormwater pipes and the sewage pipes. They also dug this huge underground tunnel to store excess sewage and rainwater during heavy storms. So they still have a ways to go, but they have managed to eliminate a lot of their CSOs. Springfield, similarly, is just finishing a project right now that will reduce their CSO discharge as well in a similar way. So I think those are two really big communities that have huge CSO discharges, so it's a good example. Yeah, I think probably, as you're indicating, the biggest obstacle to managing CSOs is the cost. And a lot of these costs are borne by communities that have disproportionately low income. So it's difficult to then increase the rates for people who can't afford sewage and water rates at that level. So I think some less costly options, which could be done in combination with sewer separation, are these low impact development projects where even little things like downspout disconnect, instead of having people's gutters drain directly into the system, just disconnect that and have it drain into their yard or into like a little mini bioswale. That reduces the burden on the system, and it creates sort of this opportunity for green infrastructure where instead of rainwater just smashing into the ground and into the system, it can filter more naturally. So even those small projects, rain barrels, rain gardens, green roofs, make a big difference.
Throughout my time learning about CSOs, I started to realize how financially burdensome tackling this issue really was. I started to wonder about what institutions are in charge. What does legislation look like? What does funding look like? And how do we support our EJ communities? To help me answer some of these questions, I brought in environmental analyst James Plummer from NUIPIC and policy director Catherine Lang from Mass Rivers Alliance.
Policy and legislation relating to CSOs differs from place to place. Regulations can be made at different levels of government. Federal regulations from the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, state from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, or the Mass DEP, and local, city, or regional governments. In Worcester and Springfield, where these two cities don't fall under the state permit for stormwater management, they create their own. This can create a lot of inconsistency between municipalities and their regulations surrounding combined sewer overflows. To complicate matters more, Massachusetts is also one of 3 states that is non-delegated. This means that we don't have state authorization to create a NIPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. Instead, we go directly to the EPA. Regulations commonly look like goals set by the EPA for different cities with timeframes that can be decades long. These goals can be paired with enactments of consent decrees, which are legal documents that lay out specific parameters that need to be met within a specific time frame. The municipality then creates projects that fall within the guidelines of the consent decree. Oftentimes, the timelines of these projects are so long because the cost and disruption associated with sewer separation is extremely high.
But on the flip side, our climate is changing at such a rapid pace that our regulations struggle to keep up with it. So, how do municipalities fight through the biggest hurdle, which is the price tag? Funding can come from multiple avenues, but throughout my interviews, there's been one common denominator, and that's the state revolving fund. Here's James and Catherine as they explain what the SRF is and other places that funding can come from.
Essentially, the state revolving fund is a mechanism with the federal government and states which provides loans to communities to fund different infrastructure projects like wastewater, stormwater, some work on the non-point source side, but predominantly it's for wastewater infrastructure. So there hasn't been a huge push, although it's been in the works to get more funding from the state revolving fund programs to stormwater projects. So with the state revolving fund being a state and federal partnership, the federal government provides a grant to states. States also provide a share, and at that point, states are the ones who determine how those funds are allocated. So they develop a priority project list and an intended use plan for how they intend to distribute those funds. And municipalities can apply for funds through their state's SRF programs to fund, like I said, a variety of projects associated with water or wastewater.
Funding for water infrastructure primarily comes through the state revolving fund. The EPA administers the Clean Water Trust, which is administered to the states through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. These two pots of money are the primary way that municipalities find funding for large water infrastructure projects. The State Revolving Fund typically is given to municipalities via loans. They are low interest or no interest loans, so the best rate you're going to get for this kind of project. But it is still a loan, and as we've seen, these combined sewer overflows are happening almost exclusively in environmental justice communities. Towns like Fall River, Lawrence, Holyoke might not have the millions of dollars required to pay back a loan, even if it is at a no interest or low interest rate. So the funding can be a challenge sometimes, and that is partially why this problem has been left for decades. We've known about it, but the funding can be a challenge to get at one time for this kind of project. State revolving funds can also be given out in grants. It doesn't have to be a loan. Grants are less common in the SRF, but do occur. I will also say that there are federal grants available, particularly for combined sewer overflow mitigation. Those grant programs have exponentially more need than they're able to fill. For example, in the past year, the Biden administration added $50 million to the EPA's Combined Sewer Overflow Grant Program. It's called OSG, I forget what the acronym is. But that federal grant program for combined sewer overflows has $50 million in it. That's great. That is not going to cover sometimes one city's projects. So the funding need is incredible.
There is a lot of push happening right now to allocate more funds toward disadvantaged communities. One of the big pushes for funding to go to disadvantaged communities is the Justice 40 initiative that came out of the Biden administration, and that essentially dictates that 40% of federal dollars go toward disadvantaged communities, goes toward benefiting disadvantaged communities. So a lot of states and their SRF programs right now are funding different projects with principal forgiveness. So whatever their loan amount is, they won't have to pay back the initial $100,000 or what have you. It really varies depending on the state, but there's a lot of push to connect with communities and just better inform them of the SRF program. That's one of the big challenges, is that they don't know that the SRF program is out there. So connecting them with financial resources, technical resources to apply for these loans, and once they've applied, getting them connected with different contractors and stuff like that to get the work done is really important.
The notification system, passed in 2021 and implemented in 2022, proved to be a huge win for environmental groups throughout the state. Catherine was one of the members spearheading this bill, and she saw firsthand the lengthy journey it has taken to become a law.
I can. The sewage notification law took 8 years to pass, and this is a bill, now law, that was just requiring public notice that combined sewer overflows and sanitary sewer overflows occur. This bill was filed by Senator Pat Jalen, as well as Rep. Linda Dean Candle and Rep. Denise Provo. The three of them all come from communities that have combined sewer overflows, so they have heard from their residents that this was a problem, and filing this bill was their way of trying to make change. We heard from one of the legislative sponsors that their inspiration to file the bill came from a young resident. It was, I think, a high schooler or a college student who was paddling on the Merrimack River and saw untreated sewage and called her senator and said, "This is disgusting, something has to change." And the senator said, "You're absolutely right, I'm gonna file this bill." That being said, it took 8 years to pass in the State House. That is common for legislation. Sometimes things can move really slowly in the State House, but this bill is one that we thought was pretty common sense. Let's protect people's public health. Let's make sure that folks know when and where waters are safe to engage with. Let's particularly protect environmental justice communities, because we know that these happen almost primarily in EJ communities. And let's also raise awareness about this problem so that we can move towards fixing it. Fixing CSOs will take a lot of political will, a lot of funding, and a lot of time to build and mitigate the pipes, to create new solutions with green and gray solutions. That will take political will. The public has to know that there's a problem in order for them to know that there are solutions that can be pursued. When the bill finally passed, it was signed by Charlie Baker. He had a signing ceremony for the bill because he knew that there were a lot of folks who really cared about this bill. There was a lot of groups who were involved in advocating for it, and by the end of the bill's journey, he felt pretty strongly about the bill as well, so he had a little signing ceremony for it. It went into effect in July of 2022. So after the bill was signed into law, that was the end of the legislative journey. That was a victory for all of us who've been involved in advocating for the bill. But then there was another journey, and that was in the regulatory space. Once the bill is signed into law, that is certainly time for reflection and celebration, but there's work to be done after that. The Department of Environmental Protection, Mass DEP, then went to make the regulations for the bill. That process also has public comment opportunities. There was iterations of regulations that came out that we and many partners read and commented on and gave DEP feedback on how we thought they could make this program the most impactful possible. When it finally rolled out in July of last year, they had kind of a soft launch for sewer operators to begin the notification program, and then in the following January of 2023, the full regulations were in effect. So that was a larger set of data that sewer operators had to collect and submit to the state. Now we've had over a year of this program being on the ground, so we can take a look at it and see how it's working, what more we might want to ask for. The two biggest takeaways from this law being in place are, one, that growing awareness of sewage pollution. For many people, it's the first time that they are thinking about their sewer system. They are hearing the terms combined sewer overflow, sanitary sewer overflow. So that education has been really important, even if it is grossing people out. It's important that folks know how their sewers work, and know what that means for water quality and recreation and climate. And the second piece that came from that bill being on the ground now as a law is the data collection. Now we have a state portal where, for the first time, all of the sewage pollution data is being collected by sewer operators and being amassed in this one central database. So it's public. You can Google CSO data portal for state of Massachusetts and look up every single incident that's happened. You can filter it by where you live. You can look up your city. You can look up your waterway, as well as a date range. So you can look up how much sewage has been discharged in this past month, or if there was a rain event yesterday, maybe you're curious, I saw it was raining, I wonder if a sewage overflow happened. You can look that up now and you can see where and when the sewage is occurring. This is really helpful for policymaking, so we know where the hot spots are, so we can see which communities are experiencing the most sewage pollution, and we can also track like how much rain has to happen before one of these overflows occurs. So it is a very helpful tool for advocates and for lawmakers to see exactly the scale of this problem in their own community.
Throughout my interviews, I asked everyone the same question about the notification system. What is it? And in their opinion, how can it be improved? Their responses centered around the difficulty of understanding the language within the system.
So CSO is complicated everywhere, but CSO is extra complicated in Worcester. And that combined sewer overflow facility has been taking in this combined sewer and treating it since the mid-80s. Last year, there was a new notification system that began within the state of Massachusetts, which is a wonderful thing. We want to get more people aware about this. But it had very standardized language that every facility or every community had to use, and it didn't apply to Worcester, so it became very confusing for folks. What it says is that there were so many million gallons discharged, and you couldn't break it up more than that. Recently, they worked with DEP to be able to modify that language so that now when you get a notification from the city of Worcester when there's a CSO event, it says there were so many millions of gallons received into this facility and there were so many million gallons treated. And typically it's 100% that's treated. Sometimes there are rare occurrences that there's either malfunction at the facility. So that happened this summer actually, where they ran out of chlorine. You can only keep chlorine so long. It loses its potency over time, and they're a small facility compared to many others, and so the manufacturer just didn't provide them enough chlorine and they wouldn't bring it in time. So there was untreated discharge from that. Other times when the water is so high and the precipitation is so extreme, the facility can't handle all of that flow, and so there's untreated discharge. But most of the time, when you're getting this notification and when there is this high amount of precipitation and we're having a CSO event, that water is going through a two-step process of taking out the solids and then going through this chlorination and dechlorination process. So that bacteria is not present within the CSO discharge.
Yeah, so we were definitely big supporters of the Sewage Right to Know Act. I think everyone should have the right to know the quality of the water that they're fishing in or boating or swimming in, and that's really important. And it needs to be available to everyone in the language that they speak and read. It needs to be available online and physically at the place where the discharge is. We really support all that. At the same time, some of the systems that are being used for notification are really overwhelming. It's a lot of notifications all at once. The message is not entirely clear as to when it is safe to go boating, swimming, and fishing. So I think the intent of the law is good. We support it. It could be improved in implementation by having a more nuanced or easy to understand message and being delivered in a format that makes sense. So instead of getting maybe 50 notifications all at once when it's raining, getting one message that says, hey, it's raining, this is the state of the river, and this is when we think it will be safe to go back in.
Yeah, I think the notification system is a step in the right direction. It's definitely not the best system. We could have done better. And a lot of the reason for this is that there's a back and forth between the municipalities that own these sewage plants and advocates such as myself and the state. You know, there's a lot of players involved, and so to try to find a common ground over how this should be done has been very difficult. So if you look at notifications right now, if you're an average citizen, you're trying to understand them, forget it. They're just too hard to understand. You know, these are emails that are sent out by the sewage plants, and they each do it a little different way. It's very hard to understand what it is they're actually trying to tell you. So what we would like to see is a system where it's geared more towards the consumer, completely towards the consumer. You want to know whether or not a river you live next to is safe or unsafe. You should be able to go somewhere or be contacted by a text message or an app or something like that, an email, website that says, yes it is, or no it's not. And it will be, if it's a no, it's going to be a no for, next couple of days or something like that. Something simple.
Massachusetts and New England as a whole has a charm incomparable to any other region. There's just an indescribable beauty to a quintessential Massachusetts town, although I will admit to my own biases. Making this documentary has been so incredible because I've been able to see firsthand the towns, cities, and the people that make it this way. And that's why taking action to eliminate CSOs is so vital. We've seen the volume of stormwater that we can get just through this last summer. The river and beach closures may have stopped us from recreating during virtually the only 3 months that we can really recreate in, but the uncertainty and the lack of research on how CSOs affect our public health is even more concerning. Yet, many of us don't even know what a CSO is. There have been a lot of moments throughout this process where the future felt pretty grim. There was no clear pathway on how we could realistically deal with combined sewer overflows, mostly due to the costliness, disruption, and lack of public knowledge. But those reasons aren't good enough for me to give up. There is no good reason why anyone should bear the environmental consequences of an aged and failing sewer system that they just inherited by living where they do. Fixing the system will only come when we decide to work together to fix it. In my first interview with John, he described his goal of banding together all of the towns and cities along the Merrimack River to advocate for CSO mitigation. He talked about changing the narrative from town to town. Instead of pointing the blame at one place or the other for their CSO discharges, he said, let's come up with a plan together that uplifts our neighbors, especially those who have been put in a difficult position at no fault of their own. And I believe that with that sentiment, there is plenty of hope for a cleaner and safer future.